Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's panel about the European Union and democracy. My name is Lukas Schmutz. I am head of the editorial board of Swiss Radio DRS, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce to you the two panelists. On my left, Mr. Michael Reiterer. Mr. Reiterer, as you know, is the ambassador of the European Union to Switzerland. He used to be in different other positions as a diplomat, as a trade envoy for Austria, amongst others in Brussels, and he's not just a diplomat, but he's also a lecturer at various universities. And it's a pleasure for me to announce that, because he will probably a bit less restricted in what he has got to say than if he were just here as a diplomat. Then, on my right, Andreas Gross. He is a member of the Swiss lower chamber of parliament, the National Council, as a representative of the Swiss Socialist Party since 1991. And he is a politician, of course. He's also representing Switzerland in the Council of Europe. He is the head of the Socialist group in the Council of Europe. And he's also a lecturer at various German universities that I do not need to enumerate here. Now let's get to brass tacks. And first of all, let me set the tone and not talk directly about the topic of democracy, but rather the development, the evolution of the EU in general. May I ask the first question to Ambassador Reiterer. Mr. Reiterer, the European Union, and you are of the same age, young or old, whatever you wish to call it. Now, if you compare the two biographies of you and the EU, you as a person, of course, first there was growth, then development of character, personality, and profile, and then in parallel the biography of the European Union, where there's growth and growth and growth, and less profile, less personality. And that's kind of ironical, isn't it? Now, I'd like, thank you for what you said about me. That was nice. As far as the European Union is concerned, I do not agree with you. Because when we talk about the European Union, we started with the European communities and the economic community. And there's been a lot of change. Now, in simplified terms, the European Union, I'm using the same term, although it was the European Community for coal and steel first. Then there was a free trade zone. There was a lot of work done on tariffs, and it wasn't really of great interest for the public. People were not really directly affected. It was a matter for the experts. And it was fine. In the meantime, the European Union emerged little by little and added the political aspect. The single market was created, the euro, the external policy was created, and the EU is now in a phase where it has a more direct effect on citizens. And they, of course, want more of a say. They want to have co-determination. But we're talking about a totally different unit or entity now. And I have a feeling that the European Union is a little bit like me. It's developing its profile and personality. And today, the European Union is an important international player. So it's got character. It's got soft power, as we call it. We are playing on the international playing field. We are a soft power. We are not a military power. We don't want to be a military power. So we do have character. So I think I look quite similar to the European Union. Now let's look at a shorter period of time, Andy Gross. If we look at the European Union, and not across its 50 years of age, but rather since 1992, having said that, the most important steps were taken until 1992, and since then, the expansion, the extension was very rapid. Why? At the same time, there was less deepening. Is it true that there was too much growth and not enough personality as far as the last 15 years are concerned? No, I don't think I can agree with you. I would like to give a similar answer as Mr. Reiter. The fact that the European community only covered the privileged half of Europe, and the rest of Europe felt excluded and was excluded until 2004. And that was a tremendous weakness, a lack of character, the people from Eastern Europe would say. And it was a mistake by the Swiss, most of all, and also the Germans and the Italians to say Europe is Western Europe, forgetting that Ukraine, for example, that Chagall grew up in Minsk in Belarus, and that Ukraine always wanted to be European. For the Swiss, Europe stops in Austria already, and that, of course, is a mistake. So the character of the EU was not complete, and it only matured in the 90s. Since the end of the Cold War, it became what it always wanted to be. But you're right, of course, when you say that those who devised Europe to overcome the conditions that have led to the wars, they could never have imagined that there was going to be a euro, but no European constitution. In 1992, the then president of the Commission, or the Dutch diplomats then, they had a terrible trauma. They wanted to have a political union as well, not just the euro as a currency, but also the possibility to have a economic policy. And for this, you need legitimation. They wanted more than just the euro. And this didn't transpire in the majority in 1992. And this would have to be analyzed. And this is, of course, a problem, but it's not a lack of character, it's rather a lack of completion, if I can put it this way. On the other hand, it is also true that those who, after the Second World War, did not live in democracy, had to do without democracy. Now what happened since the 90s? Democracy may not have been the top priority in their political commitment, but rather economic integration. These countries wanted to be with those on the sunny side of Europe, leading a good life. Of course, everybody said, yes, we are democracies, we are market economies, but the elites were not prepared to share power with the citizens. Then it is maybe on the other side, hopefully. Now, let me come in on that. In the 90s, after the wall came down, not only did Europe show character, but also responsibility. The new states were given the possibility to join quickly, and until 2004, until they joined the community, they were supported, they were helped, and that was certainly a stabilization measure. And I feel that the extension was one of the bigger successes of the European Union, in the interest of Europe, in the interest of all of us. And Europe is still bigger than the European Union, and I think we have to state that quite clearly. And I think we do need the political aspects. If we don't have the political aspects, then we reduce Europe, we shorten Europe, as it were. It's wrong to say that the European Union has just an economic goal or purpose. Jacques Delors once said the single market is something you cannot fall in love with. Well, I agree with that. So what we need is something new, something visionary. One needs policies and visions. And if it weren't for the visions, the European Union is not going to be successful. So it's wrong to reduce the European Union to economic matters. We need politics, we need culture as well. And that will not be a problem as far as you two are concerned. But if we take stock soberly, the economic aspects were the most decisive aspects in integration and also the most efficient things. Now, with the expansion, the extension towards the east, it's the economic aspects that were counting rather than the political aspects. These were the driving forces, weren't they? Well, you can't really separate it this way. Mr. Reiter, of course, is correct. Today, the EU is much more than just an economic structure. We're going to discuss that. The experts do not really agree, but 50 to 60% of the law that is applicable in the member states is coined by Brussels, and business laws are just 1/3. So there's a second third: environmental law, social legislation, immigration policy, inner security, and so on. So Europe is much more than just the economy. But the economics, is the focal point of the success story of Europe, and that's why Europe is so attractive for those who haven't joined yet, with a few exceptions. And I do agree with you. I hope you don't get me wrong. You could have also put it the other way around. Yugoslavia didn't have this perspective to join, see what happened in terms of nationalism, and these nationalist potentials also existed in Slovakia, even in Poland. If it hadn't been for the perspective to join, we do not know what would have happened there. Because nationalism has replaced the ideology of communism, and those countries that were going to join the European idea was stronger than the communist legacy and the nationalist legacy. And the question is about the future. Will the foundations also be stronger? And this is probably what you're aiming at, Mr. Schmutz. Now, if we could extend this question, couldn't we say that the countries of Eastern Europe have what we call a civilized nationalism also in the EU? For example, if you look at Václav Klaus in the Czech Republic, in his case, nationalism is not something negative. In their historic experience vis-à-vis of the Soviet Union, it was the foundation, the platform for change. So the national aspect is much more important now after the extension towards the East. I'd rather speak about patriotism than nationalism. I like that term much more, patriotism. And I'm not nitpicking here, because everybody's got a special relationship with the country, the place one grows up in. That's patriotism. Nationalism, of course, can be excessive, and there are different types of nationalism. We shouldn't talk about it. We don't need to talk about it. And I have a great deal of respect as far as our new member states are concerned in terms of patriotism. We shouldn't forget, after many years of communist subjugation, they became free. They became sovereign states that had self-determination. And what did they do? They didn't say, we are us, we are a country. They were prepared to join the European Union because they believed and they were convinced that they will become more sovereign, they will become more secure in the European Union and the NATO. They were clever enough to join the NATO first and the European Union afterwards. But they never had the reflex of saying, we are sovereign again, and I now want to use my sovereignty by myself. So pooling sovereignty in favor of more security and to become stronger by that was in the heads of the politicians of these countries from the very start, and also in the populations. Now, the question about the pace. It's quite astounding. Let's look at Bulgaria. The pace is really breathtaking, and the European Union is thus faced with problems that were not that relevant before. We were able to really talk about deepening than before. Well, no. I don't agree. The problems existed before. They were not invented. When the extension strategy was prepared, the Union tried to help all the states. You shouldn't forget that the intellectual, cultural infrastructure had to be recreated. There was no competitive law, for example, to talk about the economy. The courts had to be reorganized. The legal system, the pension scheme system had to be created. Within 15 years, those states have done something that the old states would not be able to do. Now, in many of the so-called old states, people talk about reform of the social security system. Who's doing it? Nobody, or almost no country. Those states had to do everything in just 15 years. And you speak about the high pace. Well, the high pace means that you have to act responsibly, and the region had to be stabilized. Now, some nations may have joined the EU prematurely. That is undenied. They may not have been ready, politically speaking or economically speaking, but that's not the first time it happened in the European Union. It also happened with Spain and Portugal when they got rid of their dictatorship, when the Greeks got rid of their colonels. The European Union said, yes, you can join the European Union now. Economically speaking, no, but politically speaking, yes. It was an act of stabilization, and it was an act of responsibility, which, of course, has its price. But when you talk about Bulgaria and Romania, there was something new that was introduced. For the first time, a monitoring mechanism was introduced. The Commission has to report at regular intervals whether everything is working the way it ought to work, and it's not just fair weather reports, but rather reports telling what works and what doesn't work, and there is a sanction mechanism. If you note that something is not complied with, then money can be withdrawn or retained, and it's been done so. So we are not blind. We work together with those countries, with their governments. We offer them an impetus, an incentive. We don't want to sanction them. We would like to give them an incentive to reach the European level, and it's going to happen, I'm convinced. Your question about the pace. Well, we shouldn't see it from the point of view of Switzerland or Western Europe. You have to put yourself in the shoes of a young Polish citizen born in 1960 or 1970. He must have felt excluded for decades, and they had to wait from 89 until 2004, 15 years, and that was very long. They couldn't study, they couldn't travel freely. They felt excluded in the 70s already. Well, yes, I agree that is their perspective. So many people complained. Understandably, they said, we can't wait that long. But Mr. Reiter, I think you put it very nicely, and it's the proper answer also for the Swiss, that you can gain sovereignty if you join, because the pooling of resources is what the Benelux states did, and also the Scandinavians in the 60s and 70s. If you get together, you can extend, you can expand your sovereignty. And if I look at Poland, Czech and Hungarian politicians, then I'm not quite sure whether they understand that, whether they endorse that. The difference between patriotism and nationalism is that a patriot loves his own country, but he also loves the other countries, while a nationalist doesn't like the other countries, because he thinks the other country is an enemy and a zero-sum game. And if you look at the votes in the European Council of Ministers, some of the politicians, some of the representatives are very selfish. They say, we have now gained sovereignty and we don't want to share it again to that extent. And the EU may need some learning processes in terms of democracy. That could be brought across in a democratic fashion now that they feel integrated. It's a nice discourse, but I don't think it is really 100% honest in all cases. So I think those people may have the same problems as many Swiss. Having said that, the more countries that are joining, will the EU not have a critical mass, a critical limit at one point? Well, can the EU accept to grow more and more and open its doors to all other countries and still continue to function and to work? I think it is definitely a challenge, and I call it a challenge. And you have to rise to challenges. We are currently not able to say we are not going to let a number of countries join. We can say not today. But we are currently negotiating with Croatia and with Turkey. Iceland, during the crisis, a solitary island, they want to be a member as well. Then we've got Serbia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, Albania, we've got Kosovo. These are European nations. And we mustn't forget, it is in the European Treaty that the states have to have a democratic constitution according to the Copenhagen criteria. There has to be rule of law, market economy, human rights have to be complied with. Those states have the right, if they want to do so, to be admitted to the European Union. So this is clearly ahead of us. They will have to be admitted. And we have to be careful. By focusing on the states that have a perspective to join, we should not create any new limits, keeping those out that do not have the perspective to join. And this is why we've got what we call the European neighborhood policy, which gives all the states that are European neighbors and that have no possibility to join right now, they should be allowed to participate and contribute to the European Union with a single market and also with some programs, almost everything with the exception of decision-making in the institutions. But of course we will have to ask about the question about Georgia, definitely. But right now we're saying no perspective to join. Therefore, it's part of the European neighborhood policy, as we call it. The same holds true for the states of Northern Africa. They have no perspective to join, but they cannot be excluded. They should not be excluded. So the goal or the objective would be to have a free trade association with those countries and also contribute to development, because otherwise we will not be able to control the problem of migration. And right now, we do not have it under control. You see it every day in Lampedusa, in Sicily. And this is why we have to also make a commitment in these countries to give those people in those countries to have a better life in the countries they love, because they're also patriots. That's part of our responsibility. It's quite clear. The priority of the extension perspective is interesting. Let's now have a look at the way the European Union is structured, what rights, what inner constitution has it got, and let's have a look at foreign policy first. Now, can I come in maybe with one point, Mr. Schmutz? Well, we have to understand that we've learned from the Second World War the exclusion of the Jewish people from civilization. That was a fundamental lesson. Nobody should be excluded. This is what we've learned. And this is why the admission perspective is a basic character of the benign character of the European integration. But there's no objective geographical border. But the capacity has got to do with the inner constitution of the EU. And this is interesting also as far as Switzerland is concerned, although it works in Switzerland. But many Swiss people do not know that participation increases variety without the need for standardization and with a respect for variety. And this internal constitution, this inner constitution, if it is improved, the capacity to integrate, the ability of the EU will improve. And that is important because in terms of peace policy, in terms of geopolitics, it's very important that Turkey can serve as a bridge. If it joined the EU in 20 years from now, and Ukraine has always been part of Europe, they want to be part of Europe, and to exclude them would be a terrible mistake. This is why we should also talk about the internal constitution, because it was done for 6 or 10, but not for 30 or 35 member states. But over the next 25 years, Europe must integrate 35 states. This is why the inner constitution plays such an important role. But we see that the reform processes for a better internal constitution cannot be found in those new member states, but rather the existing member states have a hard time with that as well. If we look at the question just how the definition of joint foreign policy could look like, then we see that as soon as we have a crisis, for example, the Iraq war, the solidarity is over very quickly. If you look at the response to the Iraq war, you see that there's the UK, Germany, Spain and Poland, they're very far away from the EU, and it's certainly not the expression of a joint inner solidarity and position in Europe.
Well, that's one of the most difficult questions, and they apply on 3 different levels, which I think you need to distinguish. I think the first one, and perhaps the most difficult, is the extremely tricky question relating to Poland, Czech, Hungary, etc. They don't know about Willy Brandt. They know about Ronald Reagan. For them, America is number 1, and Europe is in second place. They wanted to get straight into NATO and into EU. And for them, the Americans represent, through NATO, security. So in the Iraq war, they were on the side of the Americans, and Germany and France were on the other side. England was also on the side of the Americans. So there's tension there. And there's this open question which requires a lot more discussion than has actually taken place. The second thing, well, can we just stay with the foreign policy for the moment? So what you're saying is that there can only be a common foreign policy if there is pressure against Europe from outside, and not if Europe is required to work together actively and on the basis of its constitution. Well, it depends on how you define foreign policy. Have a look at the conventional understanding of old-fashioned foreign policy in the military area. Then you're in an area of tension and confrontation, definitely. But foreign policy is a lot broader than that. There's also trade. And trade is part of community policy. Europe speaks with one voice. In the World Trade Organization, it speaks with one voice. And that is how we can be on an equal footing with China, Japan, America, and other trading forces. Same thing in developmental assistance. The European Union and its members are the world's biggest providers of development assistance. That's part of foreign policy as well. So with Schengen, with Dublin, you also need a common asylum policy. Same again. So there are many areas where there is real common foreign policy. But if you just stick with the hard, firm, old-fashioned definition of foreign policy, then you get into a discussion which from a perspective of democracy is very important, because there's a fundamental mistake here, namely that the European Union is seen as if it were a nation state, which it is not. It is a coalition of states, a federation of states. Now, they have made moves towards common foreign and security policy, but it's not actually the objective to have common military policy at the moment. That is something that applies to a nation state, but not something that applies to the European Union. And that is because the European Union is made up of 27 sovereign member states, which work very closely together in some areas, even to the point where they adopt a common foreign trade policy, agricultural policy, and in other areas they simply coordinate and nothing more. So that means that the EU in the future must accept that it will not be able to participate in geopolitics and power. So if you recognize the truth of saying that Europe can only be a global player if it participates in the global power play, then you're saying it can never participate. Well, it depends whether you're talking about hard power or soft power. If you're talking about soft power, I would say yes. If you're talking about power in terms of military power, armies, rockets, missiles, and other military aspects, then I would say no. I think that increasingly in the process of globalization, Europe is seen as an exporter of standards. And it is in the interest of the European economy, of European business, that as many companies, as many nations rather as possible, accept the standards that prevail within the European Union, and that gives them automatically a competitive advantage worldwide. In common foreign policy, and it is a common policy, not a single policy, in the common policy, the message is about the values of the European Union. We want respect of human rights. We want no capital punishment. We want that to be embedded in our foreign policy, and that is something which is then enshrined in agreements with other partners. There is a human rights clause in such agreements. So what's clear from this discussion is that we need to be clear about what objectives we have. Where we have a common objective, there is a good chance of becoming stronger and achieving it. But we won't be able to do it across the whole board of foreign policy elements as a nation state can, as the United States can. President Obama will be able to decide, to decree things. We don't have an equivalent figure. And when people say the Americans are so strong and the Europeans are so weak, they are asking for more Europe, more institutions, more sacrifice of sovereignty. And at the same time, we hear people say we don't want to do that. Churchill wasn't much of a help when we're talking about sharing sovereignty, because Churchill talked about the United States of Europe without including his country, England. But I also think that we need to consider these aspects more deeply. The Confederation is not a state, a nation state. The state in Switzerland applies only to the cantons. Well, there was the change in 1848. So the European Union is still in the 19th century with regard to Switzerland. Well, formally, you're absolutely right. We say it's a confederate state, but in many aspects, in certain aspects, the European Union is more integrated than Switzerland. Now, on the question of foreign policy, the difference is clear, but I think that in certain other aspects there is more integration. Freedom of movement in the area of changing working place, it's a lot more constrained than it is between Germany and France. I think that in EU countries there is an enormous amount of influence applied on Brussels and the autonomy, from Brussels rather, and the autonomy of individual EU states in certain areas is less than cantons have. And there's need for a better foundation here. People are right when they say, from a foreign policy perspective or from security policy perspective, Europe needs to be stronger. But at the same time, there needs to be a certain amount of co-determination. And this is the second level that I wanted to come to. The reason that in 2005 the Dutch said no was for the first time they were asked what they thought about European integration. For the first time, although they've been there since 1975, in 1992 the French had the chance to do so for the first time. So in these first 30 years, there has been a situation where people have had to, or perhaps have had the choice of doing so, but I don't think that there was really a choice. I think it was the elite who decided, and when Delors came, he said that it's necessary to integrate people, but the core of statehood is military and security policy, and to share that with other nations requires a really high level of willingness to integrate, and that just doesn't happen overnight. This is a process that's happened only over the last 10 or 20 years, and the situation is the same now as you've said, is that populations are really only on the margins of this whole process of integration and are not fully in favour. The process of the current Lisbon Treaty is simply a symptom of the second shortcoming of the European Union, which is the fact that it's distanced itself from the Europeans. Now there is an attempt to reduce that distance. Unfortunately, the Lisbon Treaty has been rejected in 2 countries. The European Union has now come up with a new Lisbon Treaty, which is slightly different, but only slightly. The only difference being that they're now trying to smuggle it past the people who voted against it. In Switzerland at the moment, every canton has its constitution. A constitution is a treaty for the people. Now, the EU doesn't have a constitution. It has treaties, which are treaties with the states. There's a limited nationhood here, and nationhood is kept for the nations alone. Since 2000, it's been clear that the distance between citizens and the European institutions is huge. There is a chasm between the two. People feel politically alienated, and the European authorities wanted to patch this up. The Nice Treaty, it was felt, was very difficult, so they thought, why don't we make a new pact? The first one was on European human rights, but there wasn't a mandate for a constitution. It was simply a different form of treaty. And the European meeting drafting this came together and produced this ultimate result, which didn't succeed. But a constitution requires the support of the people, as in Switzerland, as in the United States. There cannot be a constitution without the support of the majority of the people. And if you want a constitution, it cannot be 100 pages. If people can't read something because it's too long or too complicated, then they vote no or stay at home. So if they want something, they must have it as something which is understandable. So if you're trying to draft a constitution which is then going to be subject to the people's approval, then it needs to be a lot shorter. And now, getting it past the vote, as the Luxembourg did and Spain did, it was amazing. And the fact that it failed in the countries where it did was something that was fairly foreseeable. The governments didn't have the courage in 2000, 2001, 2002 to give the mandate for the constitution. But the word actually never reflected what the document actually was, and that today is the dilemma of the European institutions today. Well, I agree with you to a certain extent. There were one or two major players in the European
Anlehnung an Philadelphia, so is it.
In the European Convent, who were taking inspiration from other models, including the United States. And what this meant was that there was an attempt to bring in more basic constitutional elements into the functioning of the European Union. Now, it failed because of the disparities within the European Union. Well, I wouldn't say that it was simply because of the disparities within the European Union. I would say it was because of the fact that the leaders were not ready to pay the price, which would be the sharing of power with their peoples. The new elite, Germany, France, the UK, Spain, they believed that it would be possible to continue building Europe as before without sharing the power with the citizens. So why do you, as a democratic activist, convinced that this construction, this construction is capable of integrating such a process? I was talking about the determination amongst the elite, and I've been working in Europe for a long time. 50-60% of my work is outside Switzerland. Many Europeans in Germany, in Austria, almost everywhere, think in the same way as the Swiss, and the Swiss don't realize that. But they're also frustrated about their own democracies, German democracy. They want more of a choice than between Pepsi and Coke every 4 years. So the parties are the same. Now, I really like Coke. I can pass a blind test with no problem. But it's a much smaller difference between Pepsi and Coke than it is between water and alcohol. So the point is that this rudimentary form of democracy is leading to the fact where citizens are frustrated with the choice that they have, and they're frustrated at national and European levels. And what we've seen has been the symptom of this frustration. In Switzerland, we've seen direct democracy, which the liberals have had to fight in the 19th century at the European level. The European elite still thinks today, similarly to the Green Party in Switzerland, I know what is good for the people. I don't have to ask the people. And it is for that reason that direct democracy arose in Switzerland. People went onto the street and spoke their views, and that's why we have direct democracy in Switzerland. I think Europe could do something like this, but the elite doesn't want to give up its power. The question is, how long can they continue to work in the way that they're working without having the people behind them, without having support? Every elite only gives or shares its power if they are forced to do so. And that's something that's decided at national elections. If Europe doesn't come up as an issue at national elections as before, then they'll be able to continue. But I think, as we've seen in Austria, Europe is coming up as an issue more and more. And this is something that might lead us forward to a genuine transnational European democracy. So, aren't we in a situation of wishful thinking in the EU? If France votes no, then they simply decide not to go to a second vote. Same thing in Ireland. He'll be happy if I don't make him answer that question. No, it's not just simply wishful thinking. Everything that we're proud of today was 100 years ago was a utopia or wishful thinking. So you can't just dismiss it as wishful thinking. There is a potential for the first time to have a participative civil law at the European level. This is an expression of the fact that there is potential. Some people want it. Some people believe it can happen, and that's why it's more than wishful thinking, more than a delusion. And you can't put that at the same level, saying that the Swiss people suffer too much from wishful thinking. What about France? What will happen after France and Ireland? Was it not the case that Europe had a belief in the fundamental democratic support for the process of integration? After what we've seen has happened, the Irish have now been treated in a way that is not really respectful of democracy. Now I know that I'm in Switzerland, having to answer that question. Well, I need to step back a little bit because we've got to this point which I said is a little bit dangerous. And you reflect that in your question. You're looking at Europe as if it were a state, and therefore it needs to be treated differently. It's a different construct. We do need more democracy. That's absolutely right. As I said at the outset, the mandate has changed, our tasks have changed, and therefore we need to review the situation. But I don't think that we must insist that we must continually strive to override the institutions that have existed for so long by transferring them to the European level. I don't think there should be that transfer of power. We have the opportunity here to make a transnational construct, a transnational democracy, a different form of democracy. This is something that we can develop. And maybe we don't have the wisdom to do that to its logical end, but it is something that is growing. You have the member states who still have their sovereignty. They have parliaments, and European Union members have to be democracies. Every member state is a democracy. It has its parliament, it has its constitutional processes. Now, if you add to that national level the European level, then you see what kind of construct we have. There has been a very interesting development here. Previously, the cooperation between states only happened between governments and via treaties, bilateral treaties. Then the European Parliament was created, which we interestingly haven't mentioned over the last hour. The European Parliament, since 1978, has been directly elected, and at every step along the path to the present, it's had more powers. And the Lisbon Treaty will once again give strong powers to the European Parliament. The whole budget will have to be approved by the European Parliament. And with the process of co-determination, it will work together with the Council. Now, following a proposal from the Commission and the agreement of the governments, the Parliament will participate in decisions which will then be confirmed by the people's representatives at the European level. Now, in the past, it's simply not been possible for European parliamentarians to participate in this way. So we are seeing the emergence of transnational democracy. And there's an additional achievement as well in the advisory committees. There's the social and economic committee and the regional one as well. And we include the organizations of civil society in this process, better than it's done at the national level. There are many possibilities linked as well to new technology. Now, if there's a proposal from the Commission to make a new law, then there's a green paper or a white paper which is produced, and you can go on the internet and give your opinion. And it's not just thrown in the waste paper basket. When the Commission makes its report, it includes such opinions. And in cooperation with neighbour states, there's no unilateral arbitrary use of power. For example, there's been an agreement with Georgia about what projects want to be done together. And then they are financed together and discussed together. And here, again, the European Parliament can make a significant contribution. So we are witnessing the emergence, as I've said, of a transnational democracy with the requisite resources. And this brings me back to the United States. If you look in the federal states in America, there's a lot of direct democracy. You can vote in California whether you support homosexual marriages or not, or how high the petrol price should be. At the federal level in the United States, that doesn't exist, because it's more difficult, but maybe it's also more important. Maybe it would have been a good idea to be able to make decisions on recent national policy. It's not your argument isn't a very strong argument. Well, unless it is a strong argument, because politics is the art of the possible. And within the European Union, a lot of referendums take place. If a lot of referendums took place for 500 million people, let me assure you that wouldn't be taking place twice a month, or 3 or 4 times a week, 3 or 4 times a year rather. And I would also say that you need to approach this differently. You can ask Europeans, do you want to introduce a tax to finance the European institutions? Do you want a European foreign minister? These are questions that I can put to Europeans. They are questions that can be understood and discussed. But simply to put a treaty in front of someone and say, just have a look at that and accept it, is simply unacceptable. There are elements of a representative democracy which, from a qualitative point of view, are not worse than those of a direct democracy. Well, so if we're going to integrate people into the process, maybe we should integrate you into the process as well, sir, and just ask whether, is it the case that only local things should be voted upon, as is the case in the United States, California, homosexual marriage, etc.? Is this not a trend towards reserving grassroots democracy for small states who can allow themselves the luxury of such methods, and at the European level just reserve it for fundamental questions? Well, he said he wouldn't be against asking people what kind of tax they want, and that's a very fundamental question of whether they want a foreign minister. That's not a local question. But nobody would have voted on, had the thought that there should have been a vote on the euro, for example. What we've heard from my colleague is that he's clearly more in favour of European democracy than many other European Union representatives. And that's something which is most welcome. Because the point is, when in Frankfurt in 1791, when in France in 1791 there was a suggestion, a draft for a constitution and human rights, it was a lot more difficult then than it is now simply to communicate something to 500 million well-educated, literate citizens. Representative democracy is never in contrast to these elements. It simply restricts itself to representation. And today, the Europeans, I believe, are more politically mature than the Americans because they have much more in common. And I think that this is something we need to recognize and welcome the fact that my colleague hasn't said anything against it. He knows very well what the potential of direct democracy is for the legitimation of the EU and the EU's diversity, because it's possible to learn a lot more from us than it is from the Americans. And the Californians, for example, have commonalities with EU member states. Obama is very strong because economically and from a foreign policy perspective, he has a high profile. But the Californians have a deal of autonomy which is higher than Slovakia within the EU, for example.
Well, have a look at the European identity. Here we have to actually work on it a lot. And we have to make sure that it remains feasible. And that's what the Swiss did. There are only 2 cantons left, so we actually have the institution of Landsgemeinde, which is direct voting. Why? Because there are more and more people around, more inhabitants, and which is why if you have division of labor, you have to have division of labor in politics as well. And if somebody doesn't like their representatives, these people will be sanctioned and not be re-elected. We have to think about being able to offer something that can actually be managed, that can be put into practice. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we went beyond our time for the panel discussion, but I would like to give you the floor now. There are 2 microphones in the room. Gentleman over there. Christoph Curley. You talked a lot. The gentleman from Basel, the one from Austria, and the one from, well, Mr. Gross, you are not from Basel? No, actually, I'm the National Council for Zurich, but I come from central Switzerland. Well, I have the following question. What would be the official language of the EU?
Frage, weil wenn wir nicht die
Because if we don't speak the same language, it doesn't have to be English, but if we don't really understand our neighbours because we don't speak the language properly or don't understand it properly, we will never be able to talk to each other. There's a question for both gentlemen, the representative of Austria and the representative of of Switzerland with 4 official languages. Well, I'll win because the EU actually has the luxury of interpreting into 23 languages, out of and into. And this is the expression for the diversity of culture. Many people say that everything is uniform, everything is mixed in. It's total nonsense. You can go ahead and make that experience yourself. For the last 52 years, Germans and Italians have been members of the European Union. Does anybody get the impression that because they belong to the EU, all Italians have turned German and all Germans have turned Italian? Nonsense. But the linguistic element is very important because the languages actually create a German discussion where political discussion can actually take place. And there is a certain lack conditioned by languages, but also has to do with sovereignty, because there is practically no newspaper that would be read in all EU countries. There is no news program on TV that would be broadcast all over the EU. This is an additional challenge, which is why we have the transnational element, which is far more difficult to manage than a national element. Within the EU, there are 5 or 6 working languages, and then we have another project carried out by the EU that every European citizen should be able to speak at least 3 languages, which is something that is promoted in schools. Wouldn't be so bad here either. Many times I take the train, and if I go from Bern to Geneva, there is a German-speaking Swiss next to me and a French-speaking Swiss opposite me, and they actually speak English to each other. Well, we mustn't underestimate the linguistic element. We have 23 languages within the EU, and we don't discriminate against one single language. So you would say it's a challenge, but practically it is quite challenging. It's quite difficult. Could you possibly say something, Mr. Gross, about the European public? Wouldn't be the problem that because of the languages, it would be difficult to have a pan-European discussion? Well, Mr. Ratterer was correct in saying that each and every single European can read EU legislation in his or her own language, which is very good. In Switzerland, everybody who speaks Romansh can also read legislation in Romansh, which is new. It's only been in existence for 10 years in Switzerland. The EU has afforded this luxury from the beginning. Secondly, EU members usually speak more than 2 languages, or at least 2 languages, and they can talk to each other in English or in French or in Spanish. There is a potential bilingualism within the EU, and they could even understand each other if they don't speak the same language. And then, talking about what do you mean? Well, you can understand each other and talk to each other without speaking the same language, because there's usually a third language that both parties speak more or less. Well, special cases. Oh, Mr. Smith, we have to picture the European public differently from just one news broadcast on TV or one newspaper. It was interesting that if one state voted within the EU, the other member states talked a lot more about this other state than about their own. And there were 49 votes in the EU about the EU in the last 49 years, and these are the elements of European public. But if we were to have European referenda to put the same question in all EU countries and ask people to vote yes or no, the European public would actually develop very fast. Now, this is not a question of understanding each other, but a lack of political will. You don't have the will to actually realize it. Well, this is the transnational element. It would be much easier for us if we had real European parties, if they were to actually represent themselves as political parties in the member countries. Now we have national parties nominate their representatives to the European Parliament, and the electoral campaign, unfortunately, is carried out with national topics and themes rather than European ones. Now this is something that we have to remedy, because the European electoral campaign, which is in the offing this year, should talk about a European thing. For instance, about a European convent. Do we need a president? What is he supposed to look like? And what kind of mandate should he have? Well, if we had the same kind of votations in all countries, we'd have it.
And 40 years of my 50 years in Europe, I'm European, but I'm very confused. I'm very confused because we in Europe seem to believe in human values against capital punishment. We want to promote that model of democracy around the world, but yet we are happy to sell them arms, guns, bullets, bombs. We are happy to sell the rest of the world those things. I don't know how we can bring those two ideas together. Even in the European backyard, in Bosnia and Serbia, there was a war going on. We weren't able to stop that. It required the Americans to come all the way to Europe to take the initiative. The Dutch soldiers were ill-behaved there. We sell arms to, recently, the energy crisis in Russia. It seems that European countries have this inner model of European values, but as long as it doesn't interrupt their relationships with Russia. Germany is very, very sensitive with its policy with Russia. The Brits are very, very sensitive with their defense policy, selling arms with Saudi Arabia. But it seems that we have an inner Europe, but countries within Europe are only asking, what is it in it for us? Self-interest only. We will join Europe if it's good for us, if it brings jobs, if it brings money. But I don't really think they really believe in the inner values of Europe.
Herr Reiter?
Mr. Reiter. Well, superpower, yes or no?
I think you made one point, which is an important one, because you referred to the war in Yugoslavia when it was falling apart. That was a disaster for Europe, and we have learned from that. And therefore we have changed the treaty, and we have tried to give us a structure, to have a better structure, to have a foreign policy. And the Treaty of Lisbon would make an additional step, because we would have something like a foreign minister. So foreign policy is necessary, and we have to work towards that end. This is clear, that we were not able to stop genocide in Europe in the 20th century for a second time was a scandal, but I think we have learned the lesson. Now, arms trade. Well, arms trade is something which is still prerogative, if you wish, of each and every member state. There is only a European competence in the sense that if there is a common unanimous decision that there should be an embargo, there shouldn't be weapons sold to a certain country, then everybody has to accept it, but it's an anonymous decision. That arms trade is a difficult one is clear, because who buys arms? Normally not the people which don't need it. And therefore, as long as we have this arms industry, we will have an arms trade. And there is, for the time being, no possibility on the European level to stop it. There is no competence for that on the European level. Typical thing where people would ask more Europe, but there we don't have it. This is a national decision by each and every state, except if there is a formal embargo.
André? Also
well, as far as Europe's failure in Bosnia, Mr. Reiter said everything that needed to be said, when I agree that everybody has learned that that mustn't ever happen again, and we certainly don't need the Americans for that. But it is extremely sad that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council,
85% of the arms in the world. And there you have only 2 Europeans, Russia, China, and United States. United States produces and buys more than all the others together. This is enormous. But I must tell you, this is for me exactly an example how an elite-driven policy is different to a policy which is citizens influenced, so to say. When Switzerland would be elite-driven, we would still have much more arms industries and much more arms trade. It was the Swiss who launched already 3 people's initiatives to reduce arms trades. And when you reduce arms trades, automatically the arms industry also falls, because he's right. When you have an arms industry, they want to sell it. When you limit the potential to sell, you reduce also the arms industry. And that's why this is for me an example that you have to let the citizens also express their will, because only then these values can be realized, which elite people, perhaps they would like to also change it, but they don't have the capacity to overcome the lobbies and the interest groups which are behind the arms trade and arms production.
But there is perhaps, we should add that there is one important embargo which is still in force, and that's the one against China, because Europe took the decision after Tiananmen to have an arms embargo vis-à-vis China, and different efforts in order to get rid of this arms embargo were not successful yet. And that's an irritant in the EU-China relationship, but it is still there, and perhaps it's also a good example that people cannot say, well, they are only strong when they talk about the small countries. China is a major country, and there is an arms embargo.
Let's hope that 20 years after Tiananmen this does not change.
Nächste Frage.
Next question. The lady over there. Actually, I'm a gentleman. Thank you for coming here. I'm Slovak, so please excuse my German. I have a question for Mr. Gross. First of all, I would like to say that I did not agree at all with what you said, that America is the most important country for Eastern Europe. In Slovakia and Slovenia and other Eastern European countries, neither the people nor the governments agreed with NATO's decision. Eastern Europe believes in Europe and in the power of the EU. Second of all, you talked about nationalism in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, there might be more nationalism than in Eastern Europe, actually. In Switzerland, for instance, one can tell that the Nationalist Party is the largest party. In France, Le Pen came second in the presidential campaign. Well, in other countries, for instance, in Austria, we have large nationalist parties. Now, the fact that Eastern Europe refused the European Constitution, well, don't you think that Western European societies should act in a civilized way and manner against nationalism? How could they make their way through Eastern European and Western European nationalism? Sorry, I got things wrong. Andy Gross should answer. Well, I'm glad about the fact that you said that. I'm sure you know better than me. But in my discussions with parliamentarians from that part of the world, I get the impression that the Americans are considered to be the only power that actually overcame the Cold War. I didn't say anything about NATO, but I would say that if I had been in this situation, if I had been under Soviet domination for 50 years, I would have wished for it as well. Well, the question is that if the Soviet Union could have been dissolved earlier, that might have been the right position. But at this point, we might have to actually extend NATO to a point where Russia would have its place. So Mr. Fischer said that recently in Germany. So if that's what you think, I'm quite happy. But I made the sad experience that what Europe has done in order to overcome the Cold War is not appreciated at its correct value by many people. Secondly, I do agree that there's too much nationalism in our country as well. But if you have a poorly developed democracy transnationally, and if people have to take a decision on what they prefer in case of conflict, they are more likely to prefer to have given clear preference to democracy if their own democracy is further developed. Although they're more distant from democracy because it has been transferred to the transnational level. And this is why we will have to democratize and federalize Europe, because this would be a basic premise for depriving nationalism of its foundations. The reasons may not be the same, but I must say that I'm ashamed of the kind of posters that you could see here as well. This is pure nationalism. To assume that others only want bad things for us, that's terrible. Switzerland is one of the countries which depends most on the world. In Denmark, if you go to a village which is no larger than Davos, it won't be possible to get newspapers in 10 different languages at the station. So Switzerland is a very open country, and that Switzerland would actually let the largest party of Switzerland put up posters like that. I must say I am ashamed of it, and I actually had to stand up for it in Strasbourg last week. Thank you. Next question. Fritz Meyer. Question for Mr. Reiterer concerning your role of EU ambassador in Switzerland. Now, what can you say? What have you reached so far? What have you accomplished so far in Switzerland, and what are you hoping to accomplish in the future? What we heard, or what I heard from you, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what your role actually is from what you said. What is your task? What's your mandate? I would like to hear about your experiences and about your outlook for the future. Well, what would be our carnet charge? I would say that the mandate of a EU ambassador is not basically different from the mandate of another ambassador of a national state. Basically, we have to consider the situation in Switzerland, and then you report back to your capital. which is exactly what each and every single ambassador does. So Mrs. Ferreira would be your authority? Well, split up. You have politics, economy, foreign trade policy. There are several topics. I think it's important because we have to explain to people in Brussels how Switzerland functions. Not everybody is aware of it, and not everybody deals with Switzerland all day long. And I will give them that secret. Now, the EU is very interested in Switzerland, which is not true in the other direction. But I would say that this is an important task. It was important for me to be able to explain what happened in Switzerland and what had to be considered in dealing with Switzerland by the EU. On the other hand, I have become the face of the EU in Switzerland. People can talk to me. I'm being invited left, right, and centre. I actually come up with fairly open policy and open diplomacy. If I sit there and say nothing all night long, people will think that they've actually wasted their evening. I think I should actually say something and make statements. If people don't agree, they're free not to listen to me. But what I'm not, I'm not supposed to persuade Switzerland to join the EU. It'd be terrible for me. Because basically this is a modern administration, and I would have to we have targets, and if I were to meet my target to get Switzerland into the EU, I would fail every time. Basically, I'm there to give explanations bilaterally and to uphold diplomatic relations. But if you're worried about it, the Constitution of the European Union says that every democratically constituted country in Europe can potentially join the EU. And it depends on who wants to join the EU. Funnily enough, a lot of countries want to join the EU. The greatest weapon of the EU holds in hand is to tell a country, no, we don't want you. Imagine we had told Hungary or the Czech Republic that. We mustn't forget it. And this is what distinguishes the EU from the United States. Way back when, of course it was a different time, but way back when the United States conquered another region, and every time they conquered a region, they got an extra star. The EU does not have an extra star for every conquered area. We simply have 12 stars because that stands for harmony, and who wants to join the EU is all right. And but if you don't want to join, that's all right too. Well, I would get an F in my report card if I were to have as a task to get Switzerland to the EU. Well, wouldn't you say that it's more specific here in Switzerland if for half a year you have Sarkozy as the chairman of the Council of Ministers, a different thing than if you have Václav Klaus? Well, actually, I can simplify things because I can simply say that foreign policy is still in the realm of member countries, and I only have to say something if I'm actually asked to do so. The Commission is not really competent for classic foreign policy. I think that we are, in a certain sense, responsible for a number of things in foreign policy, for instance, foreign trade policy, but always mandated by member countries. We can't really do what we want. We are given a mandate in order to negotiate something, and during negotiations we can do whatever will get us to reach that target, but the results of our negotiations have to be submitted to the member countries, and they can then accept or refuse it. So we're not going wild. The European Commission cannot do what it wants to. There are no anonymous powers in Brussels. Basically, it is a cooperation between the institutions. There's some competition, between the institutions of the EU, there's a measure of separation of powers there. If you know it, it's quite transparent. You can look at it on the internet. The European server is the largest in the world in all languages. If you want to hide something, we used to say in the Commission, you can put it on the internet, and that way it's well hidden because it's so large. The server is so large, that is. Another question? I would like to know, where does Europe begin and where does it end today? And even more so in the near future. When I was young, Europe was smaller than it is today. And this is why I'd like to put this question. Geography. Well, there's geography and there's political geography. If you lock in people into one room and wait until geographers actually decide on where Europe begins and where it ends, you won't get an answer because it's not that easy. I would say that you could say the 35 to 38 states that will have joined the EU if they actually want to do that. Geography is a necessary precondition, but it is not enough. Australia would fulfill all criteria: democracy, market economy, the constitution, and so on and so forth. Rule of law, yes, but they certainly could not become a member of the EU because they certainly aren't Europe. Well, Russia doesn't even want to join the EU. Russia, successor of the Soviet Union, wants to be equal in rights in international politics with the United States, with the EU and others. If you actually ask Mr. Putin, you actually embarrass him. What about Turkey? Beyond Turkey? No, certainly not. I don't know where we'd go beyond Turkey. But basically nobody objected, and this shows you what a relative notion geography actually is. When Cyprus joined the EU, because Cyprus, geographically speaking, is actually the continuation of the Asian continent. If you go back to Greek mythology, nobody would say that Cyprus is not European. Well, the Trojans used to, what the Troy would be today on Turkish territory. Armenia is in Europe. Then you have Belarus. If you take the small states as well, we have Andorra and others. Well, you'd have more than 40 states in Europe. Well, this is a question of geography. We won't talk about math. One last question. And then, for the sake of time, we would have to conclude.
Could you imagine a possibility of countries having to leave the EU, for example, because they've broken the budgetary rules? I'm thinking about the credit from governments, and who would pay the bill for that, and what would be the impact on the European Union? Well, the best kept secret in the history of the European Union is that has already happened. Greenland was part of Denmark, and Greenland in the 1980s decided to leave Europe. It's remained a part of Denmark but didn't belong to the EU, and they will be finding oil over the next 20 years probably, so they'll be completely autonomous. But I was speaking about European countries.
No, the economy is nicht.
Well, I don't know whether there's a rule at the moment in the European treaties. There's no rule about withdrawing from the EU, but there is a contrarius actus provided for. It's possible to actually leave the European Union, and there's a clause in the Lisbon Treaty which makes it explicit. And if someone wants to leave, then I can't imagine that it wouldn't be possible. It's going to be complicated, but everything can be undone, and if countries want to leave the Eurozone, then it is possible that they could do so. Over the last 10 years, since the introduction of the euro, there has never been a time that euro countries have been as happy to be members of the Eurozone as they are now. So that brings us to the end then of tonight's discussion. I'd like to thank the two participants. It's clear from our discussions that there have been significant developments over recent years in Europe, and that despite that there are still questions remaining relating particularly to how close, how democratic Europe is, different views on how those can be resolved, but both participants are convinced that there will be democratic developments which will involve a greater participation of European citizens. So I'd like to thank the participants and thank you, the audience, for your participation. And it's a great honor to introduce André Schneider, the director of WEF, who will be making a short summary of the various discussions that have taken place at the podium over the last few days. I'd also like to say that Mr. Wipf, the president of the Swiss Federation of Evangelical Churches, will also be making a statement. Participants of the Open Forum, once again we've reached the conclusion of our discussions. For a number of days we have addressed the problems facing our societies and our peoples today. We've listened to experts from all corners of the world, and we've had very lively discussions. As a responsible organization for this open forum, it was a delight to see our invitation accepted by so many people, and that you have had the possibility and enjoyed the possibility of discussing these questions with experts. And that's only possible because of the team that's been working so hard behind the scenes. I'd like to mention them. They are the really ones that have done the work. They were run by Helle Hopper from the Federation of Churches, Susi Franceschi from the World Economic Forum. Many others could have been mentioned, including the interpreters, who have been at your disposal to interpret for you over our discussions. A particular thanks to Mr. Eisentraut, who is the caretaker of the school that we're enjoying the use of. Mr. Eisentraut has been available for us, fulfilled our smallest and largest wishes, and ensured the success of our endeavours. I think that over the last few days we have addressed a great deal. I hope that you have enjoyed them. It's important that you not only are inspired by our conversations, but that you go home and use them in your life. The interest that we have received from you this year for the Open Forum is a spur for us to continue onwards and ensure that we have an equally exciting program next year. We will rise to that challenge. And in this regard, I'd simply like to say to you all, have a good trip home. And I would now like to invite you to the Open Forum 2010. Thank you very much and goodbye. I have learned, ladies and gentlemen, that it's not only constitutions that have to be short, but also closing remarks. It's important that we from the Swiss Federation of Churches say that, yes, we too have been involved. What's very interesting that's come from all of the panels is that we have heard something which isn't surprising, but the fact that it's something that's been mentioned in the 7th year of the Open Forum, which is that we need a new culture of responsibility. This afternoon, I think that we've seen Europe and the EU, we've seen that they need the trust and the confidence of the European citizens and vice versa. There's no other way. Otherwise, the distance which we've mentioned today becomes too great. Kofi Annan spoke in the Open Forum, and like Howard Dean, the former candidate for the presidency, he said we need shared responsibility. Both of those speakers said that we need to make sure that our leaders and those who are responsible need to be made accountable. Measures need to be taken, and we have our voice. We can also act to pursue our own interests. With regard to human rights, we've learned that we must fight for human rights. They are under threat. This is something that we've talked about. There are different declarations of human rights from the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, from the area of Islam, particularly with regard to women's rights. We also need a culture of responsibility. This is something that was discussed in the first panel on the financial crisis. I'm not certain that those who bear the responsibility, the powerful, and our leaders have really fully understood the kind of change that is necessary. But I am certain that there is no solution which would be above the heads of the people it affects. And it is for that reason that the Open Forum is so important. The issues that are being discussed within the World Economic Forum belong to everybody. They should be discussed by everybody. And we were delighted to see how many people came, how many young people, not so many people here this evening, but we've had full houses and many of them young. And I would like to thank the students of the École Internationale de Genève who were here participating from the first panel to the last. They have been thinking along with us, they have challenged us, and that's a real sign of hope. We are all part of the culture of responsibility. Thank you very much. Have a good trip home.